بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. In our lessons on Maraqi al-Falah, Sharh Nur al-Idah, we are continuing to look at the things that invalidate the wudu. And we had taken, in the previous lesson, in some detail, what is the legal cause for the invalidation of wudu, the illah of naqd al-wudu. And what is the illah of naqd al-wudu, just so that we recap? Yeah, it's the exiting of filth, right? And this is pointed to by the text that is the foundation for the ahkam of tahara, which is ayat al-tahara, right? The 6th verse of the 5th surah of the Quran, which establishes the rules of purification in wudu, ghusl, and tayammum, right? And this meaning, we saw how it applies to each of these matters. And we also looked at vomit invalidating wudu, because it has the meaning of, because there's texts related to vomit breaking wudu, and we looked at the rulings related to that. Now, here, if one were annotating one's notes, right, one can break down what breaks wudu into that which relates to the private parts and from other than the private parts, right? Then there are then there are masail, right? Issues that arise. One of them is that what if there is bleeding from, right? And we saw a number of such things come up incidentally, but what if something comes out from the mouth? Now, what is the problem with your mouth when it comes to determining flow? Saliva. Right? So if a dot of blood came out, there's saliva, and there's actually a lot of saliva in your mouth. You stick your finger in and take it out, there's quite a lot of saliva. So it'll spread. And you can do an experiment, right? Take a drop of something colored, like take a drop of some colored juice, just put it on your skin and see what happens, and then wet your skin, and then put that drop there. The one drop wouldn't have flowed. When there's water already on the palm of your hand and you put a drop, what happens? It'll move around, right? And it'll get mixed with that. So how does one deal with it? This is what he tells us next, right? He tells us, وَدَمٌ غَلَبَ عَلَى الْبُزَاقِ أَوْ سَاوَاهُ, right? فقال الشارح رحمه الله تعالى وهو الإمام أبو الإخلاص الشنبلالي رحمه الله تعالى وينقضه دم خرج بفمه, right? And wudu is invalidated by blood that exits from one's mouth. غَلَبَ عَلَى الْبُزَاقِ, and it overcomes the saliva. البزاق أي الريق أو ساواه, or it is the same as the saliva. أو ساواه احتياطا, out of caution. It's the same extent. ويعلم باللون, and it is known by color. It's known by color. فالأصفر مغلوب, so yellow is the saliva has overcome the blood. So you assume that wasn't flowing. وَقِيلَ الْحُمْرَةُ مُسَاوٍ. It said that red is level. وَشَدِيدُهَا غَالِبٌ. And intense red is the blood overcomes the saliva. And then in the commentary he mentions a number of other issues. وَالنَّازِلْ مِنَ الرَّأْسِ نَاقِضٌ بِسَيْلَانِهِ. Blood that came down from the head, like from within, any part of the head, if it came into your mouth, so there wasn't a wound in your mouth, right? Or it comes down to your nose, right? To the nose or enters your mouth, right? It breaks because of its flowing, right? وَإِنْ قَلْ بِالْإِجْمَاعِ. Even if it's a little by consensus, right? Because the blood could be coming from an internal wound in your head, so there if it's a little, but if there's a wound, right, somewhere, because that flowed. وَكَذَا الصَّاعِدُ مِنَ الْجَوْفِ. Right? Likewise, blood that came out from your jawf, from your body cavity. رَقِيقًا. Right? That is raqiq, that is fine, meaning that it is fayasil, right? So it flows, right? بخلاف العلق مثلا, right? Contrary to alaq, contrary to clotted blood. وبه أخذ عامة المشايخ. So if you found blood in your mouth, if you know that it came because someone has abrasions inside their throat, for example. So there, if it was clotted blood, it doesn't break. But if it was flowing blood, it does. Right? How would you know though that it was flowing blood? The sign that you simplify, if you have blood in your mouth, if it was more than your saliva, you can assume it was flowing. Right? Whether it's from the mouth or from elsewhere. You don't have to complicate it much more than that, right? وينقضه نوم لم تتمكن فيه المقعدة من الأرض. لم تتمكن فيه المقعدة من الأرض. And wudu is broken by sleep in which the rear was not firmly seated. There are two positions in the madhab about this. Right? There are two positions within the madhab regarding this. The relied upon position is what's mentioned here by Mawlana al-Shurunbulali, and this is what's mentioned in the Durr al-Mukhtar as being ala al-madhab. This is the madhab position, right? That what is it that requires wudu? Right? What is it that requires wudu with sleep? The criteria is تمكن المقعدة من الأرض أم عدم تمكنها. It's whether your rear is firmly seated or not. That's the criteria. So from here, if there's a here, this is now this is called النقد الحكمي, right? Right? النقد الحكي. So there are nawaqid haqiqiyya lil wudu. There's actual invalidators of wudu where there is actual or effect. There's considered to be exiting of filth, actual or effective. Filth exits, actually or effectively. Effectively in the case of the worm or gas, etc. Because it passed through where the filth passes through. النقد الحكمي is effective in invalidation of wudu is when you sleep. Is sleep an exiting of filth? No. Or the other ones? Is it? No. But الناقض ما لا يخلو عنه عادة. Right? What the invalidator is that which sleep or these other things is typically not bereft of. Right? And he'll quote the hadith about that. So the relied upon position here is the opinion mentioned by Imam Ashur-Mulali. The other opinion is the opinion mentioned in Quduri and mentioned by a few others as well. And given the importance of Imam al-Quduri, it had influence and so and this in Durr al-Mukhtar, Imam al-Haskafi says this is ala al-madhhab, right? This is the madhhab opinion, right? Right? So because in the right? Because we will see in the things that don't break wudu, he said that what happens if you're leaning against something? So the early Hanafis differed about this, and apparently there's something discussed in the majalis of Imam Abu Hanifa, because there's two riwayas from Imam Abu Hanifa, right? Which is لو كان مستندا إلى شيء لو أزيل لسقط. What if you sleep reclining against something? If that thing were removed, would you fall over? Like, so someone's leaning against a pillar or a wall or a chair, right? So the reasoning there is that it's not the naum, right, that is the naqid, right? It's not the sleep that breaks wudu, but the expression of, this is where this also, both the upside and the downside of Tanwir al-Absar. In the Tanwir al-Absar he says, وَنَوْمٌ يُزِيلُ مِسْكَتَهُ, sleep in which the tightness of the limbs is lifted, right? Because when you sleep, ترتخي الأعضاء, the limbs relax, and we'll see the hadith about it, right? وإلا لا, right? So sleep in which the limbs relax, which would be any sleep where the rear is off the ground. And by the rear, they mean the actual point of exit of the filth, right? Actually or effectively, right? And so the argument there, من ناحية النظر, is when you go to sleep, recline, leaning, with, mustanidan, reclining against something such that your weight is on your back, not on your legs or rear, then what happens? There's a zawalul miska, of this the quwwa التماسك. So therefore it would break. However, and it's not without its reasoning, and you can see it but Imam al-Haskafi says على المذهب. The madhab is that it does not break wudu. If you lean against a wall or a pillar, a chair, etc. So this is in Hashid ibn Abdin, it's page 66, right? 266. He says, أي على ظاهر المذهب عن أبي حنيفة, according to the ظاهر of the madhab, the outward purport of the madhab from Abi Hanifa. وبه أخذ عامة المشايخ. This is the generality of the scholars, meaning the scholars of verification, not just من هب ودب. وهو الأصح كما في البدائع. And this is the stronger of two opinions according to the بدائع. But the other opinion has strength. If you pause and think, when you're leaning and just sort of relax, you'll find that your mid area is a lot more relaxed if you just sort of try to visualize the muscular state of your mid area between when you're leaning back and when you're sitting, right? Okay, experiment over. And then he says, so this, and there's a good discussion on this in بدائع الصنائع. واختار الطحاوي والقدوري رحمهم الله وصاحب الهداية النقد. الطحاوي chose that wudu is broken. Now Imam Tahawi has a lot of independent opinions. So his choosing something is not itself evidence that this is the relied upon position in the school. Quduri is early in relative terms with respect to the history of our madhab, but it's significant. It's significant. ومشى عليه بعض أصحاب المتون. This is also in other methods, influenced by Quduri, right? So the mutun that built upon, that summarize the hidayah, wiqaya, for example, or the nuqaya, they would be influenced by this as well. But that doesn't in itself indicate too much, insofar as they're sort of following this. Anyways, but that's significant, right? And this is all if one's rear is not off the ground. Otherwise, it breaks for sure. And if you're really leaning back, like you're really stretched, so actually your rear is not touching the ground, right? This is the madhab position. But what's significant وهو محل احتياط. Right? للخلاف. Right? The caution is recommended because there's ikhtilaf within the madhab about what's the relied upon position. So we say the relied upon position was in the text, but what it would mean if one goes to sleep, lying down, leaning against something, مستندا إلى شيء لو أزيل لسقط, leaning against something which if it were removed you would have fallen, right? Your wudu is not broken. The fatwa is your wudu is not broken. Don't but caution is obviously clear. Okay. So he says وينقضه, its wudu is broken by نوم, by sleep, and he defines sleep. وهو فترة طبيعية تحدث فتمنع الحواس الظاهرة والباطنة عن العمل بسلامتها. It is a natural fatra, a natural state of relaxation that occurs, that prevents the outward and inward limbs or capacity, senses, to act in their sound way, right? وعن استعمال العقل, and it prevents the active use of the intellect مع قيامه, while the intellect is still present. And that goes back to theological and intellectual discussions. What happens to the intellect while you're asleep? وهذا إذا لم تكن تتمكن فيه المقعدة. This is if one's rear was not firmly established. يعني المقعدة يعني المخرج. By مقعدة it means the makhraj. This is an important point, right? The makhraj itself, the point of exiting itself of the filth. Right? So they use maq'ada, one's rear, literally one's sitting area, right? One's rear. But they mean by the makhraj, where, the anus. Bil al-ard, from the ground. Bittija'in, such as being muttaja, on one side. Watawarruk, or one is in a state of tawarruk. Right? Like tawarruk is like the way Shafi'i sit, like with one, because, with the right leg left leg coming out from under the right leg, right? Or the women's tawarruk, which is both legs coming out from the side, because then the rear would be off the ground, right? Wastilqa, or ala al-qafa, or lying on one's back. ولو كان مريضا, right? يصلي بالإيماء, even if one is sick and praying with head movements, على الصحيح. Right? Right? وانقلاب على, what do you have then? What? وانقلاب على الوجه, right? Or one gets on one's head. Why? What's the reason it doesn't break? Sorry. Right? So why does it break? Right? Why does sleep in which one's rear was not firmly seated break wudu? This is the lam of the ta'leel, right? This is the ta'leel, the reasoning of the ruling. لزوال المسكة, because the tenseness of one's limbs goes. والناقض الحدث, what breaks the wudu is the ritual impurity that happens, الحدث عند زوال المسكة, right? What breaks the wudu is the hadath الذي لا يخلو عنه النوم عادة, or غالبا, والغالب كالمتحقق, right? So the invalidator is that which sleep with one's rear lifted is not normally bereft of, which is خروج الحدث, which is the exiting of gas. للإشارة إليه بقوله, and the Prophet ﷺ pointed to this by his saying, العينان وكاء السه فإذا نامت العينان انطلق الوكاء. In a beautiful hadith, right, related to the Musnad of Ahmad and elsewhere, the eyes are like the seal of the container, the seal of a leather sack. So you have a leather sack that's tied with rope. So the eyes are like the seal of the sack. If the eyes sleep, the sack opens. So if the sack opens, what happens? What's within it comes out, right? وبه التنبيه على أن الناقض ليس النوم. And in it, in this text of the Prophet ﷺ, is a pointing out that the invalidator is not the sleep بنفسه لأنه ليس حدثا, because sleep is not a ritual impurity. وإنما الحدث ما لا يخلو عنه النائم. So rather, the ritual impurity is that which the sleeping person is not normally bereft of. Right? فأقيم السبب الظاهر مقامه or مقامه. So the outward cause, which is sleep, is placed in place of السبب الخفي. Right? And this is an implicit logical statement. Right? The logical argument that is imploded is that right? الأصل إضافة الحكم إلى سببه الظاهر. The basis is ascribing a ruling to its outward cause. لكن قد يتعثر الوقوف على السبب الظاهر، وقد يكون right? يعني الوقوف على السبب الظاهر فيه حرج. Right? But so the basis is that rulings are ascribed to their outward causes. That's the asl. But there's an istithna from it. However, قد يكون في الوقوف على سبب الظاهر حرج. But they could be hardship in us realizing the outward cause. Like the bleeding in the mouth. Like imagine you have to keep a sensor in your mouth just to make sure there's no bleeding. Very difficult. Right? وَالْحَرَجُ مَدْفُوعٌ شَرْعًا. Or the Hanafis would, to provoke the Shafi'is, would say, الْحَرَجْ مَدْفُوعٌ عَقْلًا وَشَرْعًا. Hardship is lifted rationally and legally. We say عقلا لأن الشارع حكيم. And that would provoke the Ash'aris and get them quite upset. And the Hanafis sort of liked doing that to keep a balance between reason and textualism. But hardship is lifted. فأقيم السبب الظاهر الذي لا حرج في إدراكه. Right? So therefore, an outward indicator of the inward cause was placed in the place of the inward cause. What's the inward cause of the invalidation of wudu? Gas coming out here. But how would you know when you go to sleep that did gas come out this time or not? Imagine what kind of device you'd have to invent to have like a gasometer. Okay? It would be pretty tricky because there's not always noise and there's not always smell. Right? So how, like, it'd be very difficult to track. And even if you come up with a device, how could you like, it's haraj even if someone could afford it, let alone those who can't. So anyways, so because of that, anything like this, and this is a general principle, that we have numerous rulings where this line of reasoning takes place. But all of it's implicit. Right? Like, there's an implicit logical argument here that you need to pay attention to, which we just did, just a very simplified taqreer of. Right? Is it clear? The basis is that rulings are al-aslu idafatu al-ahkam ila asbabiha al-zahira. The basis is rulings are ascribed to the outward cause. However, قد يتعثر الوقوف على السبب الظاهر أو يكون فيه حرج. Sometimes identifying the outward cause could entail hardship. والحرج مدفوع شرعا. And hardship is lifted in Sharia. أقام الشارع. So the lawgiver placed السبب الظاهر مقام السبب الباطن. Or السبب الخفي. So the lawgiver placed an outward indicator in place of the actual inward cause. So the ruling revolves around that outward cause. So if someone, right? So see Zayd's friend, Shane, right? He decided to actually make a gasometer. And he's a billionaire. He made billions working for some tech company. He made a gasometer and distributed one to every living Muslim. So, see, Zayn went to sleep. Lying down. The gasometer says you didn't break your wudu. What would the fuqaha say? Sorry? So the gasometer says no gas came out. Doesn't matter. The lawgiver established here because al-ghalib kal-mutahaqqaq, number one. Number two, because the lawgiver himself placed this criteria. Sleep with your rear off the ground breaks wudu. Right? And this, there's some discussion on, right? And this was chosen in a number of references as being the relied upon positions mentioned by al-Tahtawi. Okay. And then a question comes up. What about drowsiness? Right? Drowsiness which is called a nu'as, is a state between wakefulness and sleep. And this should be diagrammed. So does heavy drowsiness break wudu? Yeah, so light drowsiness, you can hear most of what's around you. Heavy drowsiness is when you can't hear or make out what's around you. Does heavy drowsiness break sleep? Good. Alhamdulillah. Right? If sleep breaks wudu, if your rear is not seated, then this is entrapment. Then heavy drowsiness breaks wudu if your rear was not firmly seated. But if I was seated, even if I'm leaning down, relied upon position, I was like this and I was drowsy, then what's the ruling? Even if it was heavy drowsiness, doesn't break wudu. Why? Because I was seated. Okay, so that's والنعاس الخفيف الذي يسمع به ما يقال عنده لا ينقض. Light drowsiness in which one can hear what's being said around one does not break wudu. وإلا فهو الثقيل ناقض. Right? Otherwise, meaning if you can't hear or understand most of what's being said around you, it is breaker. It breaks. يعني مع زوال المقعدة. Right? This is obvious, right? If one's rear is lifted. Right? And is it sama' or fahm? Right? 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 النعاس. Right? 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 Now, النعاس is محل احتياط كذلك. Right? النعاس يعني 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 right? لأن خفيفه وثقيله قد لا يميز. You know, drowsiness is a matter of caution because light drowsiness and heavy drowsiness, you might not be able to distinguish it. You thought you're just drowsy for a few moments, but you actually slept for half an hour. You know, if you're lying down, right? Just close your eyes for a few moments, realize you'd slept for half an hour, right? Sometimes you may not realize a lot of time has passed. So it's a, if you go, you know, so that's obvious caution, right? Then there's a controversial opinion, right? And this is one of the places where there's اختلاف of تصحيح. So Imam Shurmulali rahimahullah says وينقضه ارتفاع مقعدة قاعد نائم على الأرض قبل انتباهه وإن لم يسقط على الأرض في الظاهر من المذهب لزوال المقعدة. Okay? Wudu is broken if the rear of a sleeping person lifts off the ground before they realize, even if they didn't fall on the ground. في الظاهر, according to the outward purport of the madhab. الظاهر من المذهب is one of those things that في الظاهر من المذهب, on what is here, what it means is what is apparently entailed in the madhab. Right? 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 So there's a few opinions, right? He takes a strict one, which is that if someone's sleeping, their rear lifts off the ground before they realize it. Because what could happen? You could end up sleeping for a while like this. Right? So if your rear comes off while you're sleeping, it breaks wudu, right? Irtifa, if it became raised from the ground before you realized it, so you could diagram it, right? Rear raised off the ground. You realize and sat back. So you fell, immediately you're sleeping, seated in the back seat. You're alone. You don't have the seatbelt on. Seatbelt helps you retain your wudu. Right? Every time your rear gets off, you sit back. Wudu is retained. So there are a number of opinions here, right? Right? Tahtawi mentions, right? One opinion is that in intabaha kullama saqat fala yantaqid. Right? If one realizes every time one falls over, right? So imagine sitting down in a car, you fall over, immediately you sit back up. لا ينتقض. وإن استقر نائما ثم انتبه انتقض لوجوء النوم مضطجعا. Right? Right? This first opinion, right? That like even if you fall over, so Imam Shurmulali says, if your rear gets lifted and you don't realize it, it breaks. If you don't realize it, the counter argument, you're not morally responsible. Are you morally responsible while asleep? No. Can you know while asleep, right? Because you're that normally, like maybe extraordinary people. But do you know what's going around you when you're asleep? No. Right? So what's the only way you'd realize that your rear is lifted? If you hit the side, like in saqata, right? So Imam Shurunbulali is being cautious here, right? That if the rear is lifted and remains lifted, wudu is broken. And that's one of several positions. However, as Tahtawi points out, فَقِيلَ إِنْ انْتَبَهَ كُلَّمَا سَقَطْ, if one realizes as soon as one falls, wudu is not broken, even by falling, if you sit back up right away. وَإِنْ اسْتَقَرَّ نَائِمًا, however, if one remains asleep, lying down, and then realizes and sits back up, wudu is broken. Because you remained in a state of not being on the ground. لِوُجُودِ النَّوْمِ مُضْطَجَعًا, because you were sleeping on your side. And then Imam Tahtawi says, this is هذا قول الإمام, this is the position of the Imam. قال في التبيين وهو الظاهر, this is the outward purport. وفي الفتح عليه الفتوى, in الفتح يعني فتح القدير, there's fatwa, right? And it's quoted in the مضمرات from زاد الفقهاء, right? And then he says وهو الصحيح في رواية الحسن, this is the riwayah of al-Hasan from the Imam, right? وبه جزم في السراج, and this was chosen in the Siraj, meaning السراج الوهاج by al-Haddadi, the author of the Jawhara being an abridgment of al-Siraj. Okay, and this is what's mentioned in, in the Hashia, right? Volume 1, page 66, right? Maulana al-Haskafi says exactly the same thing, right? ولو نام قاعدا يتمايل فسقط إن انتبه حين سقط فلا نقض به يفتى. Because Imam al-Haskafi is so economical in his use of Arabic, right? Where it's clear, it's delightful. Where it's not, it's frightful, right? So he says, لو نام قاعدا يتمايل, if one goes to sleep sitting but swaying, فسقط, and one falls, meaning hits the ground. إن انتبه حين سقط, if one realizes as soon as one falls, فلا نقض, it does not break. Meaning that if one remains on the ground before one gets up, wudu is broken. He says bihi yufta, right? 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 And this is, and Ibn Abdin says قوله حين سقط أي عند إصابة الأرض بلا فصل. You mean that when one falls, meaning when one touches the ground without delay. And he quotes Sharh al-Munya. And then he quotes the Halba, and he says قوله به يفتى كذا في الخلاصة. Right? Then he quotes the other opinion, وقيل, and he quotes a position that Nur al-Idah mentions, and he says وفي الخانية عن شمس الأئمة الحلواني أنه ظاهر المذهب وعليه مشى في نور الإيضاح. Right? Right? So there's disagreement about what is ظاهر المذهب. Right? So Imam al-Shrumbulali relied upon, who said the Zahir al-Madhab, meaning from Imam Abu Hanifa, is this. Right? Then Ibn Abdin says, قال في شرح المنية, he's mentioned شرح المنية, والأول أولى, and the first opinion is superior. لأنه لا يتم الاسترخاء بعد مزايلات المقعدة حيث انتبه فورا, because the limbs don't relax just by their lifting, by the rear lifting off the ground, if one realizes immediately. Right? Interestingly, of course, who comes after? Sharh al-Munya is by Ibrahim al-Halabi. When did Ibrahim al-Halabi pass away? 956. When did Imam Shrumbulali pass away? 1016. I guess I should know the text we're studying. So the interesting thing is that what is mentioned by Fath al-Qadir, Imam Shrumbulali is aware of. What is mentioned by Ibrahim al-Halabi, Imam Shrumbulali is aware of. He's after this, but he chose the other opinion. Right? And this is something that Shrumbulali rahimahullah himself points out in the opening of Imdad al-Fattah, that he chooses sound opinions even if the other opinion has been deemed to be more correct sometimes for different maqasid. Right? So it's very important, particularly in an age of bludgeoning in legal points, that when we point out that yes, we point out that here the predominant position in the madhab with strong argument going both ways is, if one is swaying in one's sleep, does it break one's wudu if one's rear gets lifted? No. Even if one falls over, does it break one's wudu? No, unless one remains fallen for a while before one sits back up. That's the relied upon position. And why did Shrumbulali take the other opinion? لِقُوَّةِ الْخِلَافِ. So when there's strong ikhtilaf about it, and what does this relate to? It relates to the validity of wudu. Right? So Imam Shrumbulali here is taking this position, one, because the basic cause, which is the lifting of the rear, did take place. There's already this opinion, like if you map the position on the breaking of wudu, already if you are leaning against something, there's an opinion that your wudu is broken, khalas. We say that's not the stronger opinion, but it is muqabilul asah. It has been deemed sound by giants of the madhab. Like, would you go to, like, if fiqh was like turf war, would you go to Quduri and say you're wrong? No, you'd be like, he packs, some serious fiqh strength. You're like, okay, Quduri said it, like that's a big deal. Marghinani said it, Sahib al-Hidayah. Some of the ashab of the other mutun said it, but it still remains a minority position. This is not what's in Kanz, etc. So there's ikhtilaf of tasheeh. So the legally stronger opinion is right. So here, if the relied upon position, someone is swaying in the back seat, wudu is not broken, right? Unless they fell over and remained fallen over. However, this is mahal ihtiyat, and that's the basis by which Imam Shrumbulali, one of the bases for Imam Shrumbulali taking the position that he took, rahmatullahi alayhi. From the Bulaq edition, 166, right at the bottom of the page.
First edition?
volume 1. I'll just take a picture of the page and share it. Okay, Bismillah. So that's a point of note, right? وينقضه, and of course, if someone memorizes Nur al-Idah, etc., it's good to keep an index of issues where there's at least strong khilaf. Right? So one keeps, so one knows there's a good index of where fatwa. Right? The Mauritanians would do something really cool, right? So texts are written in black, right? That's the sort of the عادة العلماء, right? عادة أهل العلم, which is why Harun al-Rashid was asked. So Harun al-Rashid asked Al-Qadi Abu Yusuf that the Bani Abbas, what color should their turbans, would their clothing be? So Abu Yusuf responded, فأجاب فورا. Immediately he responded, black. Harun al-Rashid was from the Uqala. So he asked, walima, and why? So Abu Yusuf said, لأنه به يكتب القرآن, because in that color the Quran is written. So wear that color. They also say because black has majesty to it, right? Has jalal. And of course there's many other reasons, right? There's the color of the banner of the Prophet ﷺ, etc. There's multiple reasons. So the Mauritanians, what they do with poetry is there's a tradition on multiple texts that they have a tradition of what's called the ihmirar. So you have, for example, the Ajrumiyya, that's the Nadhm, and then they have on it what's called the ihmirar, the reddening, which are the key notes that their ulama added, and these are like absolutely needed. So these are the distilled notes. ما لابد من معرفته, من شروط وقيود وتفاصيل والتدقيقات والترجيحات, right? The things that you need to know of conditions and details and verifications and clarifications and corrections, right? But it's they added, and there's a number of these. The Ihmirar of Ibn Buna, this and that. I have no idea. I haven't read any of them. And I know some non-Mauritanians who memorize some of these too. I asked one of them, but you never quote it. Because if I quote it, nobody understands what's being said because it's so terse. Anyways, but it's important with any text, right? Like a test of a student would be, you said, okay, so tell me about this issue. So you just explain it, but you don't have any clue of what's around this text. Then one's understanding is very superficial. But the Mashaykh would sometimes do that in conversation. They want to check someone out, like what are they up to? They open an issue. So someone asked about this, etc., etc. And it said, Shurmbulali mentioned such and such. And pause. And if the person has no clue what you're talking about, like, that will tell you what sort of depth of study that they had, right? Shaykh Hassan Habannaka was a teacher of the Shafi'is of the previous generation in Damascus, like all of them, Shaykh al-Bulti and Shaykh Musaf al-Turkmani and Shaykh Musaf al-Khin and Shaykh Musaf al-Bugha and his, and many others. Well, great ulama, rahmatullahi alayhi. And where I lived in Damascus, in Maidan, people talk about Shaykh Hassan Habannaka like he was just around the corner. Right? Like Shaykh Mu'min's father-in-law, who was my grocery store owner, he said, Wallah sami'na min Shaykh Hassan. Kunna ma Shaykh Hassan yawman. We were like as if he was around the corner. In one of his few things that he ever wrote, he keeps complaining that now the bottom of the earth is better for us than than being on earth because of the way people are. But one of them is حال طلاب العلم. وينقضه إغماء وجنون وسكر. Wudu is also invalidated. وينقضه إغماء, loss of consciousness. وهو مرض يزيل القوى ويستر العقل. Right? It's an ailment. And marad, they don't mean sickness in the sense that you got sick. مرض, he says, أفتعتري البدن. It's some harm that befalls the body. يزيل القوى, that lifts one's physical capacities and covers over the intellect. وينقضه الجنون, إغماء وجنون. وينقضه جنون ومرض يزيل العقل ويزيل القوى. It's an ailment that lifts the intellect. يزيل العقل أي يزيل قوته. Right? بحيث تخرج عن طور التكليف. Right? This is not like here. We're not here to define junun insofar as who is considered majnoon in court, in terms of moral responsibility, in terms of marriage, divorce, etc. So there's a lot more to say about junoon, right? Here just mentioned in passing that someone does have that, and for lifting moral capacity, you don't need izalatul aql, right? But zawalu asl al-tamyiz, right? Someone loses basic capacity to discern. Like someone can walk, they can, their intellect's there, but the aql is alatul tamyiz, is the instrument of discernment. Right? يزيل العقل أي من حيث التمييز, right? من حيث التمييز. Okay? So you can't, but they can't distinguish. So someone goes and says, "Uridu tufaha." Right? So I want an apple. So someone says, $50, $50. This person goes, they count $50, they give it to you. The guy can't distinguish between a naf' wa dar. Okay? I tell him, look at the earth up there. Jamila jiddan. So he can speak. So there is some intellect, but he can't distinguish. Right? So, nasal Allah al-afiyah. And you have Yazidul Quwa. This is wasf, that it can strengthen certain abilities. Right? This is wasf yakthur wujuduhu. Right? Sometimes someone loses strength, they may have extraordinary strength, etc. But this is just a wasf. It's not a shart lazim in the tarif. وسكر and وينقضه سكر, and it's invalidated by intoxication. وهو خفة يظهر أثرها بالتمايل والتلعثم بالكلام لزوال القوة المماسكة بظلمة الصدر. Right? It's a lightness whose trace is manifest in swaying and in blurred speech because of the restraining capacity being lifted, right, by which one could, go straight, talk straight, etc., because of darkness in the chest. وعدم ارتفاع القلب بالعقل. وعدم انتفاع القلب بالعقل. So then, the heart, this is the spiritual heart, is not able to benefit from the intellect, because it's like, the sukr causes like, it cloudies your human capacity. Well, this is a description. They're not trying to give a scientific explanation, but a description of the athar, or the traces. وينقضه قهقهة مصل بالغ. Right? And let's read the متن. يقظان في صلاة ذات ركوع وسجود ولو تعمد الخروج بها من الصلاة. Right? So, laughing out loud in a full prayer, right? With, if one is an adult and awake. وينقضه قهقهة مصل بالغ. Right? So it's by the laughing out loud. And القهقهة هو الضحك بصوت مسموع. Right? And this is of course not an this is not an actual hadath, as Imam Tahtawi explains, right? And it's not not according to qiyas, right? 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 So one has to make wudu. Now, did a hadath happen? Someone laughed out loud in prayer. So the basis of this, and of course this is not required in the Shafi'i school, right? There are a hadith about this. The Imam Shafi'i did not accept the hadith because they are mursal. They are mursal. Right? They are related from the generation after the companions, ascribed directly to the Prophet ﷺ. So according to Imam Shafi'i, for example, the mursal is not accepted in ahkam. Right? Right? But the Hanafis accept the mursal. The hadith scholars, who generally follow the way of the muhaddithin, the usul of it were established by Imam Shafi'i. So the muhaddithin, in their method, follow Imam Shafi'i, right? By and large, right? So by the standards of the muhaddithin, the mursal, insofar as that it's mursal, is sound. It's either hasan or sahih. They would deem the problem with it is the fact that it's mursal. Now we accept the mursal. So we don't see a problem. Well, Abu Hanifa accepts the mursal. He doesn't see a problem with it. There's also athar from the Sahaba about this. Right? Imam Abu Hanifa accepts the qawl al-Sahabi in the like of this as evidentiary basis. Imam Shafi'i doesn't. Because the qawl of the Sahabi on its own is not one of the sources of tashri'ah. On its own, right? The Hanafis say, but that's what's understood from hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, right? عليكم بسنتي وسنة الخلفاء الراشدين من بعدي. Other hadiths about following the companions, particularly the fuqaha of the companions. And that's one of the differences in usul. So our usul entails accepting those hadiths. The usul of the Shafi'is entail not accepting those hadiths. They're both looking at the same evidence. Now for someone in our time what comes? Some random guy who doesn't know doesn't know Hanafi usul or Shafi'i usul, just looks at the hadith as da'if. So what? What do you mean by it being da'if? And you'll go on and on in what relates to the science of hadith. Because the concern of the muhaddith differs. Right? And there's actually a very good book by Shaykh Yusuf Naif. So Shaykh Muhammad Awama, right, has many books that a student of knowledge should read, but there's two books. One is called Adab al-Ikhtilaf, but this is not right? On Adab and Ikhtilaf, on both topics, and the Adab al-Ikhtilaf, there's no book like it really on the etiquette of disagreement. But the other is a book called Athar al-Hadith al-Sharif في اختلاف الأئمة الفقهاء, right? In the differences of the imams of the fuqaha. Right? So they're both looking at the same hadith. And part of it is that there is difference of opinion in what constitutes acceptable evidence even in the science of hadith at various levels. The same concepts that Shaykh Awama put it very nicely in this book in brief. There's Shaykh Yusuf al-Biqa'i. He actually expanded this topic extensively in the difference of opinion in أثر الاختلاف في علم الحديث في اختلاف الفقهاء. And we just took that they differed. What is a sahih hadith? What is an acceptable hadith? For Imam Abu Hanifa, a mursal hadith with a sahih chain of transmission is sahih. According to muhaddithin, over my dead body, there's a gap in the chain. That's an irreconcilable difference. Now, the science of hadith is as it is. Science of fiqh is as it is. And we study each separately, but there are matters of method in which the Hanafis differ from the way of the muhaddithin. So now for a hadith scholar to go and say, well, according to our method, this hadith is weak. Okay, good. Don't follow it. But you say, well, you can't follow the hadith. So are you a mujtahid? Say no. Abu Hanifa, his opponents, sallamu lahu bil ijtihad. And Imam al-Shafi'i, who was born the year Imam Abu Hanifa died, said, الناس عيال على أبي حنيفة في الفقه. People are like children before Abu Hanifa in fiqh. Right? So these are matters that, okay, you don't like it, أهلا وسهلا, أرض الله الواسعة. The earth of Allah is vast. Go somewhere else. لا نلزمك بهذا. We're not forcing you to do this. But even if you are a mujtahid, go debate the mujtahid. He's gone. And he was accepted. Now what are you going to do about it? Right? So that's, and practically it's an argument over and done with. We're not in an age now to argue about the ijtihad of the mujtahideen. It's done. Got 1300 years of Islamic scholarship where this has all been done and discussed. وَانْقَسَمَ النَّاسِ إِلَى مَذَاهِبٍ وَقَبِلُوا بَعْضَهُمُ الْبَعْضِ. People got into madhahib and they accepted each other. Now if you don't like it, you're the weird one. Right? So some people find this strange. So, I didn't read it in the hadith. Good. Is that ilman? Does that sharafan? Right? Increase in knowledge, you increase in honor. Right? Because many people, and it's good, they read hadith. The books of hadith, the kutub al-sitta are written according to the method of the muhaddithin, and generally they don't include a lot of mursal hadiths. By and large, they come up, but not so much. Why? Because according to their method, this is a big problem in the hadith. The Muwatta of Imam Malik, on the other hand, is filled with marasil. Of course, there are mursal hadiths in the works of Sunan, but not so often. Because they generally avoided them, though they come through. So that's one of those areas where there's just, what are you going to do about it? Right? So there are athar from the Sahaba that are sound. We accept that as evidentiary basis. And there are mursal hadiths that are sound, that for us are evidence. And this was the position of many of the early Muslims, as the works of Istidlal make clear. I just wanted to clarify the methodological point, because the purpose here is not to look in the specific hadith about it. If someone is interested, they can see some of the hadiths. I believe Imam Shurmullah himself mentions it in Imdad al-Fattah. There's a beautiful discussion on this with some methodological points in Fath al-Qadir. Okay. But this is sort of some of the hasil of what Ibn al-Humam mentions in Fath al-Qadir. Okay, Bismillah. So he says, laughing out loud. Al-qahqaha ma huwa masmu'un lahu wa li ghayrihi. Right? So he says, baligh, musallin baligh. So the laughter of a child, the non-baligh, within the prayer, it would break their prayer, but not require wudu. But the principles apply to it, which is that if they're if they're the murahiq yu'maru bihi ta'diban, right? If the murahiq min qarab al-bulugh, who is close to this age of bulugh, like past 10, let's say, they would be told to make wudu again, ta'diban, like the other ahkam, right? The mumayyiz, one might encourage them to make wudu, but you sort of assess where they're at in terms of, being mature or childlike in any moment, right? But you encourage them. It's yustahab, right? Okay. And this is, why is this required? Right? Why is this required? This is discussed in Hashir ibn Abdin, page 67 and 68. And the author of Al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, now, of course, one thing you have to keep in mind is sometimes the ulama speak about themselves with humility. You don't buy it always, right? In that, Sahib al-Bahr has many statements about really our duty is just to follow what the ulama before us have said. We can't make tamīz. Ibn Abdin says that. Some of his critics say, look, he himself said that about himself. That's just tahdhur. Right? But, and you can see, there's some discussion related to this. You can see it there. So it says amdan aw sahwan, whether deliberate or in error. So something funny happens and people start laughing. So someone starts laughing, just they're overcome. Amdan, they made themselves laugh. يعني وهي هي القهقهة ما يكون مسموعا لجيرانه. Laughing out loud is that which can be heard by those around one. والضحك ما يسمعه هو دون جيرانه. As for laughter, but not out loud, is that what you yourself can hear. Right? So ضحك يعني الضحك بلا صوت بمنزلة التبسم. Laughing without sound is like a smile. Like someone goes, right? Did they make any sound? No. Shar'an, that's like smiling. It's a glorified smile, right? But generally, قهقه is with صوت مسموع لغيره. الضحك ما يسمعه هو دون غيره. And below that, you call it tabassum. It's like a smile. Or ضحك بلا صوت. You want to call it ضحك بلا صوت? Yeah, that's like tabassum. That's like drowsiness, right? Drowsiness is either like wakefulness or like sleep, right? وضحك ما يسمعه هو دون جيرانه. A mere laughter is what a person can hear, not those around them. والضحك يبطل الصلاة خاصة. Laughing, but not audibly to others, breaks the prayer. وكلام مسموع, right? Speech that can be heard, and from that is قهقه, is ضحك. So ضحك breaks the prayer. قهقه breaks prayer and requires wudu if the conditions are broken. والتبسم ومنه الضحك بلا صوت, and smiling لا يبطل شيئا وهو ما لا صوت فيه, right? And a smile is that which has no sound. ولو بدت به الأسنان, even if one's teeth show. وقهقهة الصبي لا تبطل, and the laughing out loud of a child does not break. لا تبطل وضوءه لأنه ليس من أهل الزجر, because they're not of the people of warning. And this يجب الوضوء في هذا زجرا, right? لا حدثا. It's a command على خلاف القياس as a warning. Why? للزجر, because of leaving the ta'zeem. إنني أنا الله. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, indeed I am Allah. لا إله إلا أنا. There's no God but me. فاعبدني, so therefore worship me. Right? وأقم الصلاة لذكري, and remember, establish prayer out of my remembrance. Okay? So it's ترك يعني if قهقه has ترك يعني التعظيم والإجلال الذي هو مبنى الصلاة. Right? وقيل تبطله, and there's an opinion that it breaks it, and the tafsil that we mentioned, right? That the right, like the other rulings, you know, the al-murahiq, right? يعني المراهق is يؤمر بالإعادة بالوضوء. Okay. Okay. تأدبا وتأديبا. But there's another condition, يقظان, awake. Because someone falls asleep, let's say in sujood, in the posture of the sunnah, مثلا, and they laugh out loud, what happens to their prayer? The prayer is broken, but the wudu is valid. يقظان لا نائم على الأصح. So if the naim, if someone does qahqaha in their sleep, in the prayer, in a situation where the prayer will still be valid, which is, you know, if one prayed in the posture of ruku' or sujood, على هيئة الركوع والسجود للرجال, because the way women make sujood, for example, it wouldn't break the prayer. It would break their wudu if a woman went to sleep. على هيئة. So if a woman wanted to be, so someone complains that then women can't keep their wudu if they sleep in the prayer. First, you can't deliberately choose to sleep in the prayer aslan, right? So I want to go to sleep, and if you did, it'll probably hurt, right? Like, and number two, you're not going to stay in that posture in comfortable sleep, most likely, right? If you need to sleep, the sunnah is, if you're losing consciousness, rest and pray when you have vigor, right? If a woman wanted to go to sleep and retain her wudu, in the prayer, just make sujood like a man. It's not makruh. It's not makruh. Anyways, yaqdan. Right? So the na'im, what happens if they go to sleep and their prayer stays valid, but they laugh out loud while sleeping in the prayer? Their prayer is broken because it's all speech in prayer breaks it, but the wudu does not have to be repeated. في صلاة كاملة ذات ركوع وسجود, in a complete prayer that has ركوع and sujood بالأصالة, in its original form, right? ولو وجدت بالإيماء, even if the person themselves was praying with head movements. So سواء كان متوضئا أو متيمما, even if they were in wudu or in tayammum. أو مغتسلا في الصحيح, or they done ghusl. So how would you make wudu again? Right? So your wudu is considered lifted, even if the wudu be as a result of ghusl. Right? لكونها عقوبة, because this لكونها لكون الإعادة بسبب الوضوء بسبب القهقه, because this repeating of wudu due to laughing out loud is a punishment, عقوبة. فلا يلزم القول بتجزئة الطهارة. So does not entail that طهارة cannot be broken into parts. واحترزنا بالكاملة عن صلاة الجنازة. So what we exclude by saying complete is the funeral prayer. وسجدة التلاوة, and the prostration of recital. لمورد النص, right? Because of what has come in the text, right? لمورد النص. Right? And here Imam al-Tahtawi mentions some of the narrations about this, right? And actually the key things that are mentioned by Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam are quoted by Tahtawi in his footnote here, and he summarized. He chose really nicely because he quotes the main component of it, right? Where it says لمورد النص, right? من ضحك منكم قهقهة فليعد الوضوء والصلاة. Any of you who laughs out loud, right? Let them repeat their wudu and their prayer, right? لمورد النص, because that's what the text has come with. فلا ينقض فيهما وإن بطلتا. So if one laughs out loud in Salat al-Janaza or in the prostration or recital, the prostration, you'd have to repeat them because they're broken, but the wudu would not be broken from it. Of course, most takhrij of hadith. Well, what's the referencing you have? What copy are you using today? What does he say in Maslak al-Najah in referencing the hadith? Does he mention the hadith? That's it. Okay. Do you have the Tahtawi? Yeah, that one. Is there any referencing there? اللهم قيد لأمة سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم من يؤدي هذا العلم حقه يا رب العالمين في التحقيق والنشر يا أكرم الأكرمين. So the Prophet said, كاد الفقر أن يكون كفرا. Poverty is not far from disbelief, right? Like really, this is ظلم of the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Because what is flowing through these madahib is the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? فالإغفال عن حفظ هذه المذاهب is إضاعة السنة. It's very, very serious. Right. Allahumma salli. especially in our times when we have ready access to the tools of takhrij, quoting a hadith from Sunan al-Daraqutni, especially for a Hanafi, it's like, it's like the worshipper saying, why are you praying in that direction? It's because the shaitan told me. Because he's at enmity with you. You don't quote your enemy to prove what you're doing. Much of Daraqutni's Sunan is written to argue against the Hanafi school. Right? So to reference a hadith just from a Daraqutni in our times, particularly when we have ready access to the references, it's like saying, my enemy quoted this, establishing that it's weak, and that's my proof. That's like, I have referencing from Ad-Daraqutni plus Ibn Adi in Al-Kamil. And the book's called Al-Kamil fi Du'afa. It's a complete work on who's weak. Right? So, and that's injustice. Right? That's injustice. Now, we're not there to argue with other madhahib, whatever, but they're أعطي كل ذي حق حقه. Right? Give everything that has a right its due right. Right? And certainly, despite all the efforts, these are central books. Everybody around the world is studying Maraqi al-Falah. There is not one edition of Maraqi al-Falah without exception. There's some things that are, if we say that some editions are better than others, it's just they are less bad. There's not one edition that is anywhere close to even basic scholarly standards with respect to the Dabt al-Nas, to just the soundness of the text, or number two, in terms of referencing the hadiths. Let alone then having some footnotes that genuinely benefit the student. Insofar as the footnotes, Shaykh Abdul Rahman al-Sha'ar's edition has reasonably good footnotes. Right? But still, it's a job undone. Saying that pretty much any evidence of the Hanafis will be quoted by Zayla'i Nasb al-Raya. So he mentioned that there are hadiths about it that are musnad, and there's hadiths about it that are mursal. And then he detailed it. If you want to cheat, there's ways you can cheat. Right? It's like some things mentioned, like any issue that's mentioned in Hanafi fiqh, and it's like a common issue, but you don't know, you have no clue about the ruling. It says Ibn Abdin has things to say about this. Is there anything that's common in Hanafi fiqh that Ibn Abdin wouldn't say it? Right? But that's cheating. Like you could say that day-to-day speech or whatever, but you can't reference that in the book unless there's something very purposeful. You mention what he does say, and say the detail is there. Right? So this is, but also don't develop these bad habits. Right? These are not good habits, and it's not, وتنقض القهقهة في الكاملة ولو تعمد فاعلها الخروج بها من الصلاة. And laughing out loud breaks the complete, the full prayer, even if one did it deliberately to exit from the prayer. بعد الجلوس الأخير, even after the جلوس الأخير, because this is goes back to an issue of al-khuruju bi-sun'ihi, which we look at from the things that break the prayer. That is one of the things that breaking the prayer, deliberately doing something that would cause one to leave the prayer. Al-khuruju bi-sun'ihi is that fard. Okay? And ba'd al-julus al-akhir, because there are 12 problematic issues. Because they call al-masail al-ithnay ashariya, 12 issues. Abu Hanifa said that if they happen after the qu'ud al-akhir, now after the qu'ud al-akhir, after the final sitting, if you got up and left Is your prayer valid without giving salams? Yeah. Is it? Yeah. But there are 12 things that, if they happen after the Qurud al-Akhir, they break the prayer. Why do they break the prayer? There are two interpretations in the madhab about this. So Abu Hanifa said they break the prayer. The Sahibain said no. But some people try to cheat. They say, well, just take the position of the Sahibain. But the relied upon position is that of Imam Abu Hanifa. The difference of opinion, and there are two. There's al-Barda'i and al-Karkhi. Abu Sa'id al-Barda'i, Abu al-Hasan al-Karkhi, who differed on the reasoning underlying why these 12 issues break the prayer. Is it al-khuruj bi sun'ihi? Is it leaving due to one's own action? One has to leave the prayer by one's own action. So something that overcomes you, you didn't leave the prayer, so it breaks the prayer. And these are all things that overcome one, right? Or is it another meaning? So the other meaning argued is ما غير الصلاة في أوله غيرها في آخره. Something that would affect the prayer in the beginning affects it at the end. And there's long back and forth. This is one of the rare places where something appears to have happened in Ibn Abdin's tahqiq of the issue. It's also why, even if you don't like an edition, someone who has multiple editions, they benefit. I personally do not like the Shaykh Salih, the Shaykh Hussam Farfour supervised edition, but he points out quite usefully, his group of editors here, that something appears to have happened in Ibn Abdin's verification, because he cites Ashrun Bulali about this. But they went and checked. And what Ashrun Bulali says, and the quotes, there's something that happened in the process of transmission there. Maybe the copy of Ashrun Bulali's Risala, which we now have, with apparently reliable edition, seems to have had something in it. And that sometimes happens. That someone transcribed the treatise, so it got to somebody, they relied on it, and given Shurun Bulali's place in the madhab, it appears Ibn Abdin relied on Shurun Bulali, on a narration of Shurun Bulali's treatise, and Shurun Bulali is who he is. And there's something, but we'll come to that when we come to it. If someone's interested, they can read ahead. It won't hurt them. So this is why he says, even if one does these deliberately at the end of the prayer, it would break the prayer, and it would break the wudu. That's what we're talking about, right? وَلَمْ يَبْقَ إِلَّا السَّلَامِ لِوُجُودِهَا فِي حُرْمَةِ الصَّلَاةِ, because it took place during the inviolability of the prayer. كَمَا فِي سُجُودِ السَّهُ, just like the prostration of forgetfulness. وَالصَّلَاةُ صَحِيحَةٌ, but in this case, if one laughed out loud deliberately after the final salam, the prayer would be valid. Because it would be لِتَمَامِ فُرُوضِهَا, because one did all the fard actions of wudu. So he kind of skirts around, is al-khuruj bi-sun'ihi obligatory or not? وَتَرْكُ وَاجِبِ السَّلَامِ لَا يَمْنَعُهُ, and leaving the wajib act of salam, because giving the salam at the end of the prayer is wajib, does لا يمنعه أي لا يمنع تمام الصلاة. It does not prevent the completeness of the prayer. And then he says وَيَنْقُضُهُ مُبَاشَرَةٌ فَاحِشَةٌ. فاحشة sometimes means البالغة, right? A complete something. It doesn't mean like vile. There's nothing vile about this, right? Okay. That's why but they use this expression, right? And right? So Ibn Abdin explains, right? Sayyid al-Uqala rahmatullahi alayhi, he says قوله فاحشة المراد بالفحش الظهور, right? Some people translate this in all kinds of colorful ways, right? Okay. What's meant by fahisha here is الظاهرة, right? الذي لا الذي نهى عنه الشارع, right? Not because fuhsh, one is that which is manifest and that which is prohibit, and the other meaning of fuhsh is that which in Allah, وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ, Allah prohibits fahsha. Because if that were taken literally here, then that mubashara, then humanity had to die away. Right? كما لا يخفى وينقضه مباشرة فاحشة, meaning major physical contact between a man and a woman. وهي مس فرج أو دبر بذكر منتصب بلا حائل. It's a contact of the female private part, front or rear, with with a male penis that is in a state of erection without a barrier. بلا حائل يمنع حرارة الجسد, that prevents the heat of the body. Right? That's either there's no ha'il or the ha'il is raqiq. And the ha'il raqiq would include, for example, like a condom, for example, or something like that. وكذا مباشرة الرجلين والمرأتين ناقضة. The fuqaha, and likewise, intercourse between two men, and if the private parts get in contact, or two women, breaks wudu. The fuqaha aren't there to give you a sermon, but in our times, of course, we have to make it clear that the act itself is a major sin, and it also requires wudu, right? Even if no penetration actually took place. And this is the position of Imam Abu Hanifa, right? That in a state of erection, if the two private parts get in contact with each other, even if there is no balal zahir, there's nothing that appears to have come out, it breaks wudu. Why? Because in that state, because the principle is al-ghalib kal-muthaqqaq. The general case is as if actual, and because contact took place, it is quite possible that something came out. It's very likely something came out, but you could not see it due to the fact that contact took place. So Imam Muhammad took the qiyas. Imam Muhammad took the position that this does not break wudu unless there was balal, zahir. And there are some of the shurrah in the Hanafi school who took the position of Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, because it's closer to legal reasoning, to direct legal reasoning, which is the qiyas. Primary line of reasoning, something came out, wudu is required, something didn't, it's not required. Asl is nothing came out. But they say al-istihsan muqaddam ala al-qiyas, right? Right? The legal preference is given preference over the primary line of legal reasoning. That's the very definition. Right? Right? But here, in the dur, he says, "Walau bila balal," right? Right. So the dur, in the dur, there's all these things happening in the dur al-mukhtar, but sort of he's navigating, right? So, like the dur al-mukhtar needs like commentary around it because he's navigating. Like he's not a tour guide, right? He's showing the way, and he needs someone to explain like what's going on. Right? Because if you don't know what's going on, you're missing the whole tour. Like he's taking you to all the great places, but he's not telling you that they're there. Right? Like so, you have to pay you have to live with it. Right? That's why Ibn Abdid, who spent years on it, says until until it lifted its niqab, and he has all this colorful vocabulary to describe acquiring the meanings of the dur, right? But it's a gem. So he just says, "Walau bila balal," even if without any wetness, ala al-mu'tamad, No, he says ولو بلا ولا بلل ولو بلا بلل على المعتمد. Right? Right? According to the relied upon position. And he says قوله على المعتمد. Right? Right? And you can see the discussion in Ibn Abdin, which is page 69. For some reason my numbers are 69. Right? 69. Right? So a number of distinguished late scholars took the position of Imam Muhammad al-Hasan, and a number of people were influenced by that. Right? And Ibn Abdin discusses it. Right? And here Ibn Abdin pauses actually. Right? So this is not such a simple issue, right? Because so you'll see also for Fath Bab al-Inaya, Mullah Ali al-Qari goes down that path. Right? He appears to choose, it's been a while, appears to choose the position of Imam Muhammad al-Hasan. The author of Majma' al-Anhur, Shaykh Zada, what does he say? He says, قوله أقياس. The position of Muhammad al-Hasan is closer to the qiyas. وقولهما أحوط. But the position of Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf is closer to caution. Now, of course, we have a lot of resources on fiqh al-khilaf fil madhab, such as al-Nasafi's Manzumat al-Khilaf, the earlier Nasafi, with Imam Hafiz al-Din al-Nasafi's Sharh al-Musaffa fi Sharh Manzumat al-Khilaf. So this is one of the places Ibn Abdin pauses. Right? Right? So he gives the reasoning for what is mentioned in the Dur. Right? And that it's the ihtiyat, etc. And he quotes the position of Imam Muhammad. Right? Muhammad's opinion was chosen by the author of Al-Haqa'iq, but both the Bahr and the Nahar rejected it. Right? And this is also quoted by Ibn Amir Hajj. So this is major figures in the madhab of the late school take the position of the Imam, which is the asl in the madhab. أن صحيح قولهما وهو مذكور في المتون, and then it being in the mutun mentioned the position of Imam Abu Hanifa here, and that's a very strong preponderating factor as well. Lakin, right, this is where one has to read the entirety of what Ibn Abdin says. Sometimes people will quote, they'll read the first part, say khalas, but kammil, read the rest, right? And he says lakin fil. Now Ibn Abdin mentions the text of Ibn Amir Hajj, who chose a rare title for it. And Halabis do interesting things sometimes, if one knows Halabis. He called his work Halbatul Mujalli. Like someone, a great Imam, and others before Ibn Abdin, a number of people got the title wrong. Right? So Ibn Abdin references it in his Hashia as Hilya. Right? And Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, in several works, clarifies that it's Halba. And Imam Lakhnawi may have done so too, Allahu A'lam, before him. So you see in copies of the Hashia it says Al-Hilya, but it's Al-Halba. Halbatul Mujalli, Sharh Munyat al-Musalli of Ibn Amir Hajj, who's one of the two great students of Ibn al-Humam. I mean, of countless students of Ibn al-Humam, but the two greatest of them. بعدما نقل تصحيح قولهما, after he relates what the author of Al-Bahr and Al-Nahar, Ibnay Nujaym, Zayn ibn Nujaym and Umar ibn Nujaym. Right? Right? And Al-Bahr is longer than Al-Nahar. Right? Right? Then he says, لقائل يقول, someone could say, Al-Adhar wajhu Muhammad. The reasoning of Muhammad is more evident. ما لم يثبت دليل سمعي يفيد ما قالاه, unless there were a transmitted text that would affirm what they're saying. Now, there are people who would get upset in our times that, التصحيح بقوة الدليل. But there's a number of these great متأخرين, right? And do we accept that these great متأخرين, like Ibn Amir like صاحب البحر, author Fath al-Qadir, and Allama Qasim. And Allama Qasim, though he takes a very pious faqih role, I just stick within the madhab, that's not always true. There's a number of things where he makes tarjih. Amongst them, you can see what he has to say in his Risala on Kafa'a, for example, which is published. Ibn Amir Hajj, Ibrahim al-Halabi. Right, so here, it's an example here of Ibn Amir Hajj making tarjih on the basis of strength of evidence. That's noteworthy. Right? Then, so Ibn Abdin, the quote there from Al-Halba of Ibn Amir Hajj ends. Then he says, وَفي شرح الشيخ إسماعيل. Who's Shaykh Ismail? Shaykh Ismail Nabulsi was a sharh on the Durar of Mullah Khusro. Shaykh Ismail Nabulsi being the father of Shaykh Abdul Ghani. And his book, Sharh al-Durar, which is in the Makhtut is available, and it's actually a very clear Makhtut, is beautiful. It's one of the main things that Shaykh Abdul Ghani relies upon in his different books. عن شرح البرجندي وأكثر الكتب متضافرة على أن الصحيح المفتى به قول محمد. Says, this of course, is it actually the case? Says a lot of books, or he says most of the books are clearly expressive that the relied upon position is the position of Muhammad. And there's more. So Shaykh Ismail makes another argument. This is a compelling argument. وعدم ذكر صاحب الهداية لها في النواقض يشعر باختياره. And the author of the hidayah not mentioning it in the things that invalidate wudu gives a sense of his choosing it. يشعر باختياره. Gives a sense. But also notice the caution of the fuqaha, right? He says, يشعر باختياره. Indicates it's choosing, right? And this is fiqh. Fiqh is فهم ما دق من الأمور. Things it's not that simple. If you think it's that simple, so it's just clear cut, it's because there's myopia, right? Ibn Abdin quotes that. انتهى. And what does Ibn Abdin say? Just تأمل. Reflect. رضي الله تعالى. So he doesn't take a stance on it. Now what happens when there's an amr بالتأمل? Many people would say, خلاص. Like what is representative of what Ibn Abdin is mentioning in the Hashia, that خلاص, one could quote here, that Sahib al-Dur said this. But Ibn Abdin has tawquf in it. Right? This is not such a clear-cut issue. Right? So this again, but this is where fiqh has these janib, right? On one hand, what is of the two opinions, which is more cautious? That the mubashara al-fahisha requires wudu or not? What's more cautious? The position of Imam Abu Hanifa, that it requires wudu. And you see, this is one of the things that where there is not difficulty, one of the things that guides a lot of Imam Shurun Bulali's legal reasoning is caution. That's one of the things that made his matan quite, a blessed matan. And his sharh, a blessed sharh, like in the caution. So there's two things, but one separates two things. One is to identify what is the more relied upon opinion, and number two is, what is the fatwa opinion. And right, so this is volume 1, page 69. This sort of shows that fiqh is not so simple. So what's in Imam Shurun Bulali, this is clearly a point of obvious caution, right? And insofar as it's caution, it's meritorious, right? Also, a very strong murajjih. A very strong murajjih in all of it is, this is the madhab of the Imam. It's madhab Abu Hanifa. Right? To what extent do you need to understand his reasoning? This is madhab. Right? So حتى لو لم يظهر دليله caution is especially in something like this. But the great muhaqqiqeen paused, right? And sometimes they paused because things happen, right? Someone lost track of time, this happened, then they went to pray. Then they went to pray. They went to work. They thought they had wudu, right? Things happen. So they, sometimes we may not appreciate their reasonings so clearly. Now there's one micro fara, but it's very useful. The Ighma or Junoon. Okay, yeah, found it. Okay, Ibn Abdin also mentions this. Shaykh in passing, he throws a gem, but it's relevant because people are affected by this in our times. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik. Because they discussed the issue, because we know the wudu of the Prophet ﷺ was not broken by sleep. Right? He said, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, لَسْتُ كَهَيْئَتِكُمْ تَنَامُ عَيْنَايَ وَلَا يَنَامُ قَلْبِي. The Prophet ﷺ went to sleep lying down, got up, was going to pray without making wudu. And he says, I am not as you are. Right? And there's a number of hadiths that negate tamam al-mumathala between him and others, right? Right? So people say you can't say that he's not like other people. That is just wrong by prophetic text. And those who say that he's just human, there's no difference except that he received revelation, that's not correct. Just open the chapters on khasa'is. So one of the hadiths is about intiqad al-wudu. Wudu al-anbiya la yantaqid. And there is, in the Hashit ibn Abdin, there's a section, page 68, 67, Noble Anbiya. So now the wudu of the Prophet does not break. Does that apply to the other prophets as well? Some of the scholars said that in the hadith about tanamu aynaya wa la yanamu qalbi, is related in Bukhari and Muslim, right? And there's really beautiful discussion there from Imam Badruddin al-Aini. And when it comes to matters related to ta'zeem of the Prophet ﷺ, there's a lot of gems in Badruddin al-Aini beyond, he gets many subtleties that other commentators don't. And part of it's due to his spiritual affiliation to the Sad al-Wafa'iyya. Okay, so the basic, the fara is that that al-masru' إذا أفاق عليه الوضوء, right? Right? Al-masru', someone who has a, like, who lose, surah is like like a fit, right? Al-masru' إذا أفاق عليه الوضوء, right? This is in the Hashia, volume 1, page 67, عن التتارخانية. Okay, عن التتارخانية. Just mentions it here in passing, but it's a good point, and you can find it. It's bottom of page 68. But be careful of picking these kinds of things up, because sometimes they're tricky. So these are some of the things related to the invalidation of wudu. There's some very interesting things. What if someone went to sleep riding on a horse? Okay, and what if there's a saddle? And what if there isn't a saddle? There's all kinds of fancy things. Then they say, what if you're going uphill versus downhill versus riding straight? I'm not going to tell you the answers. And of course, it's not mentioned here, but going to sleep face في هيئة, in ركوع or sujood, إن كان على هيئة الركوع أو السجود المسنون, going to sleep للرجال, going to sleep in, does it come up in ما لا ينقض الوضوء? Yeah, it comes up in ما لا ينقض الوضوء. Right? Doesn't break the wudu. And we'll be seeing that in the next section. So we'll be looking, bi'idhnillah ta'ala, next class on Wednesday, bi'idhnillah, and 10 things that don't break the wudu. And one of them is what we mentioned. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina. But that's a quick section. And then we will, bi'idhnillah, be starting the things that require ghusl. Right? Because they require a lot less detail. So we'll be trying to accelerate just a little bit. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. But do catch these points that come up, like things like, we mentioned just very briefly about the idea of as-sabab al-zahir and the sabab al-khafi, right? The reasoning there. And it's there in the text, but try to unpack it a little bit. We also looked at the issue of the hadith al-mursal, right, and its status in the madhab. At the very least, to summarize what's there, we referred to where it's mentioned at Tahtawi, but to put, okay, this is something I need, inshallah we'll be learning more about, the hadith al-mursal, that it's accepted as proof in the Hanafi school, etc. And those are things that are coming up, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala.
If a doctor draws out blood with a syringe and there's like nothing that comes out of the point of exit, like actually on your skin or anything.
No, but it doesn't have to come out from your skin. بحيث يعني السيلان حقيقة أو حكما, right? حقيقة أو حكما, حكما that it exited with the strength of flowing, such that had it not been prevented from flowing, it would have flowed, right? So for example, you put a rag on top of an open wound, it soaks it all up. Did it flow on your limbs? No. That's سيلان حكمي. Now there's an issue that هل الخارج والمخرج سواء, right? So two principles. Did we stop the recording? recording, transmission, whatever? Okay, good. 'Cause this should be in there. Right? Two things. Two principles related to wudu. Right? One is that the relied upon position, and this is from the mahasin of right? Of the tanweer. He adds these gems. So he says, and this is page 62, he says, وَالْمُخْرَجْ وَالْخَارِجْ سَيَّان. And to emphasize the point, he puts the less obvious, less common first, and then the more common. Al-mukhraj, that which is drawn out, is the same as that which comes out. And there's a rhetorical tool being used there for emphasis, right? Al-mukhraj, such as if you squeezed, for example, or likewise if you took it out through an injection. The relied upon position is al-kharij wal-mukhraj sayyan. What's drawn out and what comes out with respect to the invalidators of wudu is the same. And this is al-asah, but this is where fiqh comes in. This is the stronger of one of two opinions. Right? Right? So Maulana Sahib al-Durr quotes وفي الفتح عن الكافي of النسفي حافظ الدين أنه الأصح is the stronger of two opinions. واعتمده القهستاني, was chosen by al-Quhustani. Right? وفي القنية وجامع الفتاوى أنه الأشبه. Right? And then he goes into, the thing. So the fatwa is on it. Right? And there's some good discussion in. But it's the asah. But this is where even Ibn Abidin does not consider his own hashiyah to be one of the mutawwalat. So there's some detail, you can find it there. So the relied upon position is that which comes out, which is drawn out, and that which comes out by itself is the same. So there's blood on a wound. If you squeeze it and it comes out, it came out. Whether it came out by itself or is made to come out, the same. The end result is it came out. But there's khilaf on it. And I don't recall fully. It may be Sahib al-Tabyin. I don't remember. But if you look at it, there's both opinions are musahhah. But that's also how do you access the earlier books? If you just jump in there, you'll be totally lost because there's like a battle going on and you don't know which side you're on. Right? Like total confusion. Seems like total confusion. Like what's going on? Why are some people shooting from here and some people shooting from there? Like you get parachuted in the middle of the battle and you don't know who are the good guys, right? And which way is the battle? But if you go from the later books and then go back, say, we're on this side, and this is what's going on, right? So there's rahmah. So the other opinion has been chosen. Right? So this is one principle. Al-Kharij wal-Mukhraj sayyan. That which comes out, Al-Kharij bi-nafsihi wal-Mukhraj sayyan are the same. Ala al-Adhar. According, did Shurumulali mention this? I'm surprised. Right? It was very useful. But the other opinion has been deemed strong. Right? Right? So I actually witnessed an example of this, that when you can take a less strong opinion. One of the greatest fuqaha alive, without exception, was in Jordan. He fell sick. We took him to the hospital, and there's an accident just before he arrived. So he arrived, we went into the hospital right before Maghrib time. Got to the hospital bed, adhan went. It was a military hospital, so before the Shaykh could like say, okay, let me pray, etc. And Arabs sometimes work in interesting ways, especially Jordanians. They're Bedouins. So they said, "Istarih ya Shaykh," but they kind of pushed him back, and they stuck an IV into him. They drew his blood first, then they stuck an IV into him. They didn't even ask him, like, is it okay? Kada? Military hospital, Jordanian, right? And then they disappeared. They said, prayer time has entered. So let's just wait. And nobody came. But there's commotion because there's an accident. Number of soldiers had been injured, killed. God knows what happened. Like, I'm sitting in the room. So initially, he said, okay, so given that the time has been in for a little while, I don't want to inconvenience them. I will consider that I have wudu على خلاف الأظهر, contrary to the Azhar, contrary to the more evident opinion. And he mentioned it was chosen by so and so and so and so within the scholars of the madhab. And of course, they sometimes do this also to test that you know what's going on. Because this is على الأظهر. He didn't mention of what opinion. Because if you know your fiqh, you should have istihdar of the masail, not just the relied upon, but other opinions. But then of course the things got bigger, like they were just not around. He said, okay, that time's been in. I have an excuse to wait a little bit. You don't. Why don't you go and pray? So I went. That was it. Yeah, I'm fine for now. So I went, prayed, came back. Then they weren't around. Like literally there was a bit of a commotion at the hospital. So I said, okay, he said, I think asking them to remove my IV right now would be haraj on them. So he says, فَنَأْخُذُ بِقَوْلِ إِخْوَانِنَا الشَّافِعِيَّةِ وَنَجْمَعْ جَمْعَ تَأْخِيرٍ فِي الْفُندُق. So we'll take the opinion of our brethren, the Shafi'is, and we'll combine the prayer, جَمْعَ تَأْخِيرٍ. Says it was up to me, I would pray right now, but getting them to stop when there's a public interest, right? There's people they're in emergency. So the difference between taking a rukhsa for oneself and taking a rukhsa because of other people. Of course, not all Hanafis would do that, right? Like some other Hanafis would like make tayammum there, right? For example, request a stone, make tayammum, even if they're still on the IV. But there's a number of lessons in that action. So al-kharij wal-mukhraj sawa. That's one. The other principle, and we'll close with this because there's another class. The other principle is that according to, and this is an issue where there's difference of opinion between the sahibain, but ma laysa bihadath laysa binajis. Anything that does not break wudu is not filthy. It's an important principle. So blood that didn't flow, did it break your wudu? No. Is it filthy? No. Of course, it's impermissible to eat, to consume. Like you can't swallow it. Because there's many things that are, because it's still mustaqdar. But it's not filthy. If it gets on your clothes, whatever, it's pure. Vomit that's not a mouthful, pus that didn't flow, etc. It's all, all of it does not break. It doesn't break wudu, therefore it's not filthy. So those are 2 points there. There is one point in, anyways, here do note that there's a point that's discussed in Durr al-Mukhtar. It says, however, we take one position for water and we take the other for clothes. We take another for water. That's just out of caution. It's not a legal position because something's either pure or impure legally. That's istihbaban. That's just out of recommended caution. Walhamdulillah.